improve.
Thank you. So are there questions in the room? I have a mic there. Does somebody can just take the mic? Or? Let's start it. Voilà. Alors, une question. Ah, vous avez le micro. On y va alors. Ouais, pardon. Il n'y en a pas partout.
Thank you very much. Thank you very. I'm Sibylle Ruprecht of the Geneva Academy for Peace and Mediation. Thank you very much for your presentation and interesting discussion. A lot was said about the neutrality and the need for neutrality of the United Nations and its civil servants. Given the way the United Nations is financed and the system it is financed with, doesn't it somehow take away neutrality and make it subject or maybe make it vulnerable to pressures?
Is your question addressing to somebody in particular, or who likes to? Okay.
Well, I mean, I think you can phrase that in many ways. You have pressure which is negative pressure, and then you have pressure which comes from the interest of governments to do things which are not necessarily negative. If you look at the whole history of technical assistance of the UN system, it is very much driven by the United States. It's very much driven by US foreign policy. It's very much driven by US Cold War time policy. Now, at that stage, the US values were probably closer to the UN values than, for instance, the values of the Soviet Union. But you always have to put that whole thing into a perspective. Personally, we have been. I mean, I've had to manage situations where, because certain topics linked to trade and labor standards have become politically important, and because they have got blocked in other places, we were doing a lot of those in the ILO, and we were doing a lot with voluntary financing. Now, what should one say? How many countries finance? Was the German decision at one stage, which was provoked by the consumer reactions to child labor and carpets and so on, was the German decision to give a large amount of money to the ILO to deal with child labor. Was that pressure? I mean, it came with a degree of expectations regarding personnel and regarding certain things. Later on, the ILO got about 30 million first, and then the same over a period of time for core labor standards from the United States. What do? Shall we call this pressure? I think in many cases the art, after all, of what we're trying to do is to manage these things knowing that there are always own interests in everyone who gives money for international cooperation has an own interest. The question is, how do you balance it? How do you make it so that it's tolerable, that it doesn't become unacceptable or doesn't start changing governments, at least not changing them in the wrong way.
Thank you very much. Other question? Let's try to be short, all of us, so we can go for a few questions. So, yes, sir.
Merci. Thank you very much for interesting answers to questions. My name is Rajan Petrovic. I'm Registrar of ILO Administrative Tribunal. But I have a question from what I know about international civil service. There is dilemma from Eric Drummond onwards, whether executive head should be more secretary or more general. And if it should be more general, with what means they could be generals? To what extent they can have their own political will, independent from member states or instructions from member states? And just to comment, there is much more international civil service than UN system. We have many organizations that are not career organizations, especially those involved in weapons, chemical weapons, atomic energy. They're 7 years mandate organizations, and they don't stay forever. So it's normal to have some of these people seconded. And why is that so? Or why we have two new groups on multilateralism, terribly influential, G7 and BRICS, that do not have secretariats at all? Why do we have this trend to get out from secretariats or international civil service? Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody wants to react? Mr. Howland? Or? Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize this, but
you have to be short.
I'll be short. Yes, as far as I can see, every body, every governing body or administrative body or so on, expects the Director General to listen to it. And everyone also expects the Director General to give, to solve the questions. So it's a schizophrenic situation because you're criticized if you do too much. You're criticized if you don't do enough. But you know, it's like every decision of these bodies. Usually they say that, well, write another paper. It's got to be shorter but more detailed.
Impossible job, if I understand. Yes, one question here, and then we take one here, and then I guess we have to move on to the next panel. So one question, sir?
Oui, merci. Nous allons passer à la langue de Molière pour donner l'impression qu'on est un peu à Genève quand même, non?
Avec plaisir,
hein?
vous écoute.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci. Je suis un ancien fonctionnaire. J'ai travaillé au cabinet du directeur général de l'ONU et j'étais en charge des relations avec la société civile et les ONG, ce qui fait que c'était un peu comme Monsieur Tapiola. On a les ONG, la société civile qui vient derrière, on a les États membres qui viennent, et puis on a notre hiérarchie qui vient aussi. C'est très difficile et je pense que plus on est exposé à ce genre de situation, plus c'est difficile d'être neutre. Mais moi, je voulais vous rappeler un peu, je crois que vous avez tous dû lire, j'espère, le livre d'Albert Cohen, hein, Belle du Seigneur. Et si vous lisez les 100 premières pages, eh bien, si vous regardez comment ce personnage qui a, c'était Obéité, je crois. Malheureusement, moi j'ai fait l'expérience, au niveau où je travaillais, j'avais exactement la même situation avec des, je ne vais pas dire qui, mais je constatais la même chose. Et c'est ça qui est peut-être grave dans le système multilatéral dans son ensemble, les Nations Unies, c'est qu'il y a beaucoup de difficultés à s'adapter au management moderne. Même si à l'intérieur, il y a beaucoup de cours, de formation, de travail en équipe, de déléguer, de gérer des conflits, le mode de travailler, la structure, elle est encore, permettez-moi que j'utilise l'expression, c'est une hiérarchie quasiment militaire. Vous allez de tout en haut jusqu'en bas, et puis vous avez une espèce de camisole de force qui vous empêche, et parfois vous recevez de la pression d'en haut, et parfois, eh bien, vous êtes très mal pris vis-à-vis de votre fonction, et vous avez de la peine à ça. Et je pense que la maison, aujourd'hui encore, elle vit un peu avec la même comme le roman d'Albert Cohen le démontre, et je constate, et je termine là, qu'aujourd'hui on refait le palais des nations, on le rénove, et puis la seule chose qu'on trouve à faire, c'est de tomber des murs pour donner l'impression que les gens sont dans la même salle, mais en fait la hiérarchie, la culture d'entreprise est la même.
D'accord, merci. Alors là, je pense que vous avez donné envie à plein de gens, tous ceux qui nous regardent dans le monde, sur Internet, des jeunes. Mais voilà, c'est une réalité. Enfin, c'est un point de vue à une réalité peut-être. Alors, une dernière question. Je pense que ça n'appelle pas forcément de commentaires. Ou quelqu'un veut réagir? Non. Last question. I'm sorry. The lady here was first. And
Yes.
Okay, you will have the very last question. But we have to move on.
Okay,
Lady.
thank you very much. So I might be the only Chinese here, and I really hope to participate more in the UN governance. So my question would be that, as we all know, recently in Hong Kong there is a very serious protests there, and the conflicts between the residents would be one group they fight for the democracy. The other residents, they want right to life, right to work, right to education. So in this situation, there will be a conflict between values. So my question would be, as an international organization or UN institutions, to solve these difficulties in practice, do you think the value to realize the values is the first, or to solve the problems is the first?
Thank you for the question. Who wants to answer? Okay, and you can complete afterward. So,
I think that this is something that we run into in terms of conflicts of values, but I think that it's not that difficult to resolve. Because first and foremost, our organization has to be faithful to our conventions, and that when we look at the conventions, we can see that in fact rights that are economic, social, and cultural rights do relate to political and civil rights. Not just rhetorical, they actually do interrelate in order to provide for, to achieve a better society. And so the discussions that we should have, if we were actually in Hong Kong having discussions, should relate to those with the government and with the protesters to speak about, well, what rights exist? And if you're protesting, are you actually violating the rights of others? And then how can we work together to achieve a better state based upon the respect of rights for everyone? And I think that while it's not an easy solution, it is something that's possible, and we've done it in many countries relative to protest. I mean, I can tell you protests in DRC and Colombia, these would shut things down, and this would be difficult for small business people. This would be difficult sometimes for large business people. But that the importance is that there also has to be an appreciation for the rights of one another. And if people are suffering in terms of, for example, in Buenaventura, the largest port city in Colombia, that had no drinkable water, and when they shut down the port for a month, well, the first reaction was for the government to send in, you know, the riot police and the military, and you had conflict. You had injury, you had killings. But the reality is that people were shutting down the port because they didn't have drinkable water. There was a real problem. And so we went through a very long negotiation process trying to get people to appreciate the rights of one another and resolve it based upon that framework. So it's absolutely possible to do. But I did want to say something about some of the others, and I'm sorry, I will be shorter.
please.
It's just, I absolutely agree that part of our problem relates to our inability to adapt new methods, and that we have really problems relative to doing what's most convenient relative to recruiting, as opposed to how to find the greatest integrity and competence, because it's just we have to perform within a certain amount of time. So I mean, I think that's really important. And then secondly, that just because we have extra budgetary funds doesn't mean that undermines our impartiality. Is that political support for what we're doing is important. It's not just money, it's political support. So bringing that together is important. But it also creates certain times this great importance on producing results within a year. And we can barely recruit somebody in a year. So we have great tensions between these two things. So
Thank you very much. So I am very much under pressure because there are still people asking for questions. So I give you the last word, but very, very short, because then we have to go to the next panel who is waiting also to and have very
Merci beaucoup. C'est dommage parce que, en tant que spécialiste du droit de la fonction publique internationale et praticien du droit de la fonction publique internationale, j'ai des choses très intéressantes à dire au propos des règles de conduite, les règles de conduite dont vous avez parlé tout à l'heure. Parce que j'ai exercé aussi défendre les fonctionnaires devant le tribunal et des Nations Unies et de l'OIT. Tout ce que je veux dire très brièvement, c'est que moi j'ai étudié ces valeurs, ces règles de conduite, le droit de la fonction publique internationale à l'université à Sas-Panthéon. Je l'ai exercé. Il y a un décalage entre les principes tels qu'on les a étudiés, tels qu'on enseigne à l'université, et la pratique. Mais pourquoi ? Ce n'est pas toujours la mauvaise volonté de l'administration, mais d'après ma pratique et mon expérience, c'est surtout la méconnaissance de ces règles, de ces principes, le contenu. Parce que vous le savez très bien peut-être, une seule université au monde qui fait le droit de la fonction publique internationale, tout simplement parce que le professeur qui a créé ce diplôme, c'est un ancien qui défendait les fonctionnaires internationaux, qui est à l'origine des droits acquis, Maître Sicot.
D'accord.
Donc c'est le... Bon.
Je vais être obligé de vous interrompre. Je vous remercie. On a compris votre propos de cooptation, en quelque sorte, si je comprends. Mais vous aurez l'occasion d'en reparler tout à l'heure.
J'ai rien dit en réalité.
Pendant le cocktail. Et on va passer we're going to the next panel now. I thank you very much to all of you. Very interesting. Okay, turn to the audience. So questions, let's take one question here, sir.
Thank you. My name is
Just in the mic.
I joined the UN in 1976, and I'm one of the few people who actually took their oath of office with the Director General of the UN in Geneva. I'd like to make a comment on the way we look at the UN. It seems to me that institutions always lag behind how society evolves. And I think we're facing this institutional lag big time with the UN. The UN represents nothing to do with we the peoples, it's we the states. And it's a state system as it was in 1944, 43, when big minds started looking at the way in which the UN might be set up. I think what has happened is that no state now is able to deal with transnational problems that are affecting the way in which the world works, whether it's the GAFAs, whether it's the financial flows, whether it's climate change, whether it's human rights. And I think that this disconnect between the reality of the world outside and an organization that has no transnational powers is going to become more and more big as time goes on. I would like to make a comment also on the discussion on human rights, because it seems to me that when we talk about the international civil service, we also have to talk about the example that comes from the top. And I think that on the specific issues of human rights, I can think of Sri Lanka, I can think of Myanmar, the message has not come from the top. And the nice words that after Sri Lanka, the Secretary General made about human rights up front being the lifeblood of everybody working for the organization, that has not changed because to a large extent, senior staff in the UN, and I was kind of a medium senior staff, do not think that human rights is something that they need to pursue in their work, or gender rights or PSCA issues.
Thank you. There's more, Madame. Yes, just push on the button.
Yeah, here it is. I'm from UN. I've been there long enough, and I've seen changes, and it is changing, believe it or not. But I just want to say a word on civil society. But civil society has got an immense impact right now. It's interactive with all the UN programs and activities, and especially the younger generations, because if you say that civil society is dirty money and special people who get together, NGOs who are financed by whatever, it's not true. Even if it's an NGO, anybody in the world can be a member of an NGO. So there's still a bit of human rights idealism, wanting to do better, trying to change the world. I think NGOs are playing a very, very important role right now, and I think they should be given importance, consideration, financial means, and also. I don't want to go any further, but UN is fundamentally changing. That I can really say. And as far as the Secretary, the big thing is to break the veto of the 5 Security Council people, and especially the governance in the Middle East. Some of the big chiefs over there, they do not want to change the system into democracy. But as far as changing the Secretary General after 7 years, I don't believe that is the problem. I think the problem is to have a think tank, a collective governance at the head of the UN, and with everybody participating in a meaningful, full, and functional way to the goals and objectives of the UN. I don't think the head of the UN does count a lot, unless, of course, he comes from a dictatorship country, and also if Mr. Trump paid his dues, voila, that would put things into the right direction, because UN is being solicited every single day by millions and millions of cases, and there's no way. Yeah. So if US doesn't pay.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, just an interesting point is, what is actually the weight of the Secretary General in this system? Listening to some of you, it seems that it has a huge importance. Is it really the case, or is he not just depending from what the states want? Who wants to take that?
Yeah. No, one of my colleagues here will. But I do want to respond to what this lady was saying and resolve this disagreement that seems to be about the role of civil society organizations. There is a system whereby civil society organizations are vetted in order to get accreditation to ECOSOC. And I think that's very important. And that should weed out the active civil society organizations and NGOs which are more like the profile that my neighbor was talking about. There's a danger, though, and I think that the process of accreditation is becoming politicized in a rather sinister way, but through the influence of some of those 3 big powers that I was referring to. That is very dangerous. So if the CSO is going to continue to play this very, very important role, the process of accrediting CSOs and NGOs to the UN must remain absolutely objective and in line with the values of the UN and not with the interests of the P3.
Okay, do you want to react shortly?
I mean, just think about the SDG. What we're talking about, realistically, is the single largest investment push. This is way beyond the Marshall Plan, which in itself was a tremendously successful aid program. We've done our own calculations in the order of $2 to $3 trillion a year for developing countries alone. But when you put in climate into that, it's even bigger. So we're talking about this huge investment push. And the UN has, simply listing having a list of nice things that we all agree to, which is what the SDGs are, is one thing. Actually being able to think how you mobilize those resources to actually deliver in a meaningful way and in a meaningful time frame is another thing altogether. And civil society has very little to say or do about that. This is an issue for policymakers and international institutions. And the UN is failing on that, clearly failing on that front. It's kind of fixated with trying to bring in the private sector because it believes that somehow public goods are delivered by private finance, even though they never have been historically. And that's where we need to have this debate. And I talk about monitoring as being the only issue, and getting the statistics right is actually pretty much beside the point. This is a massive public policy challenge, and unless the UN faces up to the fact that the last 30 years of kind of simplistic neoliberal policy advice has failed to even deliver investment in its own countries, the idea that it's going to do that to ensure that we get these 17 goals delivered seems to be pie in the sky, and I don't think civil society has helped very much to address those kind of issues. I really don't.
Sorry, I have to respond to that. If UNCTAD would work with civil society more effectively to ensure that the $500 billion that is bled out of the African continent every year through licit and illicit financial flows, we would solve the resources problem of the SDGs.
Let's go. Thank you, sirs, for these very interesting exchanges. One more question here.
Yes, thank you very
much.
Yes, not in English, because I may think that some of you don't speak. En français, tu veux que je le dise en français? En espagnol, en espagnol.
Anyway, let's start.
Bon, alors je reprends en français puisque j'étais responsable du statut ECOSOC à Genève. Je connais très bien le fonctionnement du comité. Heureusement, à l'ONU, il n'y a pas que le statut ECOSOC. Il y a une multitude de possibilités pour les ONG de travailler de manière diversifiée. Mais je voudrais vous rappeler quand même qu'en 2004, le secrétaire général Kofi Annan a lancé une étude avec l'appui de M. Cardozo. Et je vous suggère de lire le rapport de Cardozo, 2004. Le rapport Cardozo a voulu changer le mécanisme de travail global de la société civile avec le système multilatéral. Qui n'a pas voulu changer une seule virgule à la manière de travailler? Les États membres. Aucun État membre n'a décidé, enfin si, globalement, il y en a quelques-uns, mais depuis, avec un rapport si important qui voulait faire ce que vous disiez, une seule porte d'entrée pour la société civile avec des critères objectifs, les États membres n'ont pas voulu. Pourquoi? Parce qu'ils veulent contrôler la société civile selon l'UNDP, selon l'UNICEF, selon l'ECOSOC, selon les droits de l'homme. Et ça a rendu la chose difficile parce qu'on n'a pas une définition internationale de société civile et on n'a pas effectivement une société civile élue qui puisse faire, faire partie du système comme un pilier. Et le jour où on arrivera à ce que la société civile soit un pilier de l'ONU, là, on aura une véritable participation pour la gouvernance mondiale.
Merci. On va prendre une dernière question, parce qu'on va devoir avancer, on a déjà pris un peu de retard. Alors, allez, 2 questions, monsieur et madame, ou madame et monsieur, laissons la place.
I just want to say, if we are for values, but some of our values are linked to democracy, then we have a certain attitude to société civile and to our outreach to the société civile. So through democracy, the société civile is speaking, is electing in the best of cases, its own representatives. And these are sitting together and making policy. Now, taking the SDGs, I do believe that if the SDGs will see the light of the day and will get the financing, the only way is to get the message through to the civil society and work with civil society to get the demand for the investment through in the countries themselves. So there is no other way but the working together with société civile. And I think the approach is that the countries themselves need to understand what they can do and what they can demand in order to get the investment in. So I think that approach is the right approach, and the more we get of it, the better I think the multilateralism will work overall.
Thank you. Very contrasted views. Sir in the back.
Yes, hello. Okay, I'm Anders Johnson. I work at the ILO. I'm just curious, I just want to quickly read again the actual title of the panel, which was What to Do to Support and Strengthen the International Civil Service in order to defend the role of multilateralism. Because when I speak to a lot of people in sort of who are not at all in the UN system, the criticism I hear a lot is that civil servants, international civil servants, seem very distant. And that, for example, I keep being asked because of the ILO where I work at, you know, if you're working on helping SMEs, how many of the people there have actually run an SME? I mean, so my question to you then is, should we be rethinking how we hire people in the UN, you know, civil service? And how should we actually sort of go about that to make sure that the people who are working at the international level have experience, or at least have the ability to connect with, as you said, we the peoples, in a way that they can actually communicate to them what it is that we're doing?
Who would like to answer? Sir.
I feel that one thing that is very important that can be done rather easily is to go out for these officials and to talk with the people who they see on the street, or to go into classes, into school classes, into universities, and to present themselves and say, what is it that the UN does? What is it that our organization does? And if the people see that the officials are made out of flesh and blood and not just robots or soulless interests based on working based to represent interests, that will also change the perception, I believe. So I think one thing that has to be done is to go out and to talk with everybody.
But should that therefore be incentivized as part of your job?
I doubt that the UN would have the resources to do that, but I think it should be mandatory to have some sort of PR to go out, and because even though the work is being done, if the people don't know that the work is being done, that's what's creating this negative perception. So I think it should not only be incentivized, in the best case it should be mandatory, but obviously the resources are scarce.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. Very interesting panel. Thank you.